Imagine this. You've committed unspeakable crimes, the world despises you, and the clock is ticking down to your last breath. The guards strap you in, the needle hovers, the switch is about to be thrown. Your heart pounds, knowing every second is your last. The executioner leans closer, the witnesses hold their breath, and then, with the world listening, you open your mouth. What would you say? A prayer? An apology? A desperate plea for forgiveness? Or a final act of defiance so bizarre it echoes forever? Tonight, we dive into the most shocking, chilling, and downright twisted final words ever spoken on death row. Stay with me until the end, because number one will make your skin crawl. Death row has always been the stage for humanity's darkest theater, a stage where the curtain only falls once and the actors know exactly when their final performance begins. Some inmates tremble, clutching to prayer. Some whisper to God with tears in their eyes, but others, they embrace the end with arrogance, venom, or even sick humor, determined to carve their names into history with one last unforgettable line. Tonight, you'll hear words that will make you laugh, words that will horrify you, and words that will leave you wondering what kind of twisted mind could speak them at the edge of eternity. These aren't just last words, they're windows into broken souls. Stay close, because with every number we climb, the stories grow darker and the words more haunting. Let's count them down. Number 10, James French. James French was no stranger to violence. Already serving a life sentence for murdering a motorist he had picked up while hitchhiking, French grew restless in prison. In 1961, he strangled his own cellmate to death, not in a fit of rage, but with chilling calculation. He later admitted he did it because he wanted the state to execute him rather than spend his life behind bars. French's plan worked. Convicted again, he was sentenced to die. By 1966, the day of reckoning came. Reporters swarmed the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, eager for a story. As he was strapped into the electric chair, French glanced at them with a cold smirk. And then, with the switch about to be thrown, he delivered a final line dripping with grotesque irony. "How's this for your headline? French fries." Moments later, the current surged through his body, ending his life instantly. His words splashed across newspapers nationwide the very next morning. The perfect macabre headline. The impact was undeniable. James French had turned his own execution into a punchline, cementing himself as the killer who laughed at death and manipulated the press from beyond the grave. Number 9. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was one of the most terrifying criminals America ever produced. Born in 1891, he spent his life drifting across the country, leaving behind a trail of burglaries, arsons, assaults, and murders. He bragged openly that he had killed at least 20 men and raped hundreds, taking pride in the destruction he caused. Panzram was finally caught after shooting and killing a prison employee, Henry Warner, in 1929 while incarcerated in Leavenworth. That crime sealed his fate. In 1930, the day of his hanging arrived. Panzram walked to the gallows without fear, burning with hatred for humanity. The rope was placed around his neck, and when the executioner fumbled with the knot, Panzram snarled, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard! I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." His words were pure venom, the last declaration of a man who despised the world and wanted it to remember his rage. That single line became infamous, a reminder that some killers meet death not with regret, but with a final poisonous strike against humanity. Number 8. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy lived a double life. By day, he was a respected contractor and community volunteer who dressed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. By night, he lured teenage boys and young men into his home, where he tortured and murdered them. Over the years, he killed 33 victims, many of whom he buried in the crawl space beneath his Chicago house. His downfall came in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest. Police traced the boy's last known whereabouts to Gacy, and a subsequent search of his property revealed a nightmare of human remains. The so-called killer clown was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. In 1994, after 14 years on death row, Gacy was led into the execution chamber for lethal injection. Families of his victims gathered, waiting for remorse or even a hint of humanity. Instead, his last words were a sneer, "Kiss my ass." It was one final act of arrogance, a curse hurled at the grieving families. His defiance echoed across headlines, cementing his reputation not only as a sadistic murderer, but as a man who carried his contempt for others straight into the grave. Number 7. Thomas Grasso. Thomas Grasso was a drifter whose life spiraled into crime and violence. In 1990, while living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he murdered 87-year-old Hilda Johnson by strangling her with Christmas tree lights and stealing her Social Security check. Months later, he killed another elderly woman, 81-year-old Leslie Holtz in New York. His greed and brutality shocked both states. Grasso was eventually arrested after pawning stolen items and carelessly bragging about his crimes. Extradited to Oklahoma, he confessed, and the death penalty quickly followed. On March 20th, 1995, the day of his execution, Grasso was given a last meal request of SpaghettiOs. Instead, prison officials served him plain spaghetti. As he sat strapped to the gurney with the lethal injection ready to flow, his final words weren't of remorse for the elderly victims he murdered. They weren't an apology. They were a petty gripe. "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this. It was absurd, grotesque, and unforgettable." His last words turned a double murderer's execution into a dark punchline for history. Proof that some killers die as selfishly and absurdly as they lived. Number 6. Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore was a violent career criminal whose life spiraled into murder. In 1976, just months after being released from prison in Utah, he killed 2 men in cold blood, a gas station attendant named Max Jensen and motel clerk Benny Bushnell. His crimes shocked the quiet communities, and Gilmore was arrested after witnesses and ballistic evidence tied him directly to the killings. Convicted swiftly, he refused to appeal his death sentence, even demanding that the execution move forward. In January 1977, he faced a firing squad at Utah State Prison, the first person executed in the United States after the death penalty was reinstated. Standing before the rifles, Gilmore stared his executioners dead in the eye and uttered 3 chilling words: "Let's do it." The line was so striking that it later inspired Nike's world-famous slogan, "Just do it," a billion-dollar catchphrase born from the defiance of a double murderer. Gilmore's last words echo as a disturbing reminder of how even in death, killers can leave a cultural scar. Number 5. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, often called the Damsel of Death, was a drifter whose life of abuse and instability erupted into violence along Florida highways between 1989 and 1990. She lured men with promises of companionship before shooting them at point-blank range, stealing their cars and possessions. In total, she murdered 7 men, including Richard Mallory, David Spears, and Charles Carskadden. Her undoing came when police traced stolen property to pawn shops and matched her fingerprints on abandoned vehicles. Witnesses described her, and most devastating of all, her lover Thierry Amour cooperated with police, helping elicit a taped confession. Wuornos was convicted and sentenced to death. On October 9, 2002, she was strapped to the gurney in Florida State Prison to face lethal injection. Reporters, prison staff, and a handful of witnesses leaned in, waiting to hear what America's most infamous female serial killer would say. With a cold, almost manic look, Wuornos declared, "I'll be back, with Jesus." There was no apology, no remorse for the lives she stole, only a bizarre promise, or perhaps a threat, that left the chamber in uneasy silence. Her words echoed across headlines and documentaries, cementing her legacy not as a misunderstood victim, but as a remorseless predator who carried her rage into death itself. Number 4. Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris was a career criminal whose violent path escalated to murder in 1978. That year in San Diego, he kidnapped 2 teenage boys, John Majewski and Michael Baker, forced them to drive him around, and then brutally shot them to death before stealing their car to use in a bank robbery. His crimes shocked California. Harris was caught within hours, tracked down by police after eyewitnesses placed him at the crime scenes, and ballistics tied him to the killings. Convicted of the double murder, he was sentenced to death. After years of appeals, Harris became the first person executed in California in decades. On April 21, 1992, he was strapped into the gas chamber at San Quentin. As the cyanide pellets dropped and the fumes rose, Harris looked out at the witnesses. Instead of remorse, he delivered a bizarre pop culture quote from Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." It was surreal, cold, and unforgettable. His last words turned a brutal double murderer into a man remembered less for regret than for quoting a comedy movie as he died, leaving a disturbing imprint that mixed horror with absurdity. Number 3. Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector's crimes shook Arkansas in 1981. After a petty argument, he shot and killed a man named Arthur Criswell in a nightclub. Days later, when police came to arrest him, Rector pretended to surrender, then suddenly pulled a hidden gun and shot Officer Bob Martin in the back, killing him instantly. Moments later, Rector turned the gun on himself, firing into his own head. He survived, but with severe brain damage that left him childlike and impaired. Despite arguments that he no longer understood his punishment, Rector was convicted and sentenced to death. On January 24, 1992, he faced lethal injection at the Arkansas Department of Correction. His final meal included steak, fried chicken, and pecan pie. When the dessert came, Rector calmly pushed the pie aside, telling guards he'd save it for later. The remark sent a chill through witnesses. It revealed his tragic detachment from reality, as though he didn't grasp that there would be no later. His words left an eerie legacy, remembered not as defiance or apology, but as a haunting glimpse into the broken mind of a man walking into death without truly knowing it. Number 2. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Charming on the outside, he hid a sadistic darkness that drove him to kidnap, assault, and murder at least 30 young women across several states during the 1970s. Bundy lured victims with fake injuries, a cast on his arm, or pleas for help, before overpowering and killing them. His crimes terrified the nation, and he was finally caught after multiple escapes when investigators linked him through forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and his distinctive Volkswagen Beetle. After a sensational trial filled with theatrics, Bundy was sentenced to death. On January 24, 1989, he was strapped into the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Witnesses leaned in, waiting for a confession, an apology, some sign of remorse. Instead, his final words were chillingly hollow. "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." No apology to the women he murdered, no acknowledgement of the terror he unleashed, just a cold farewell to those who stood by him. His last words underlined his narcissism, the final act of a man who refused to give closure to his victims' families, leaving only silence where remorse should have been. Number 1. Timothy McVeigh. For our number 1 spot, we have Timothy McVeigh, the domestic terrorist who orchestrated the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, murdering 168 people, including children in a daycare center. His truck bomb left the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in ruins and the nation in shock. McVeigh was tracked down quickly after eyewitnesses identified his getaway car, and police discovered bomb-making materials linking him directly to the attack. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On June 11, 2001, he faced lethal injection at Terre Haute Federal Prison. Hundreds of survivors and victims' families watched via closed circuit as the bomber entered the chamber. Witnesses expected remorse, fear, or maybe even silence. Instead, McVeigh looked calm, almost smug. For his last words, he recited the poem Invictus, ending defiantly with, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." It was not an apology. It was a declaration of control, even in death. His chilling choice of poetry left many outraged, seeing it as a final slap in the face to his victims. McVeigh's words carried no comfort, only the bitter reminder that even at the end, he chose arrogance and defiance over humanity. Final words are supposed to reveal something about the soul. They are the very last chance for truth, for apology, for humanity. But what do these reveal? Arrogance, defiance, madness, and sometimes just stupidity. We've heard killers laugh at death, spit venom at grieving families, and even turn their last breath into a twisted punchline. Others tried to sound profound, but left nothing behind but coldness and contempt. So now I'll ask you, if you had one breath left, with the world listening, what would you say? Would you try to make peace? Would you beg for forgiveness? Or would you, like these killers, let your darkness speak one final time? And if you want more chilling tales from death row, stories of murder, betrayal, and the final words that echo long after the grave, subscribe, because this story is just the beginning.